Thank you for joining us today on EdFile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. The last 5 years have been the hottest on record, while global carbon dioxide levels have increased by 26% since the 1970s. Though the coronavirus pandemic is expected to cause carbon emissions to fall, sustained action will be needed to halt the continuous degradation of the climate. That's according to the World Meteorological Organization. The WMO's Global Climate 2015 to 2019 report released on this year's Earth Day, that is on the 22nd of April, found that the last 5 years were the hottest on record, and the next 5 years will likely set a new global mean temperature record. Well, let's find out more on today's episode of the program. Do stay with us. All indicators show that climate degradation has sped up in the past 5 years. We've seen that atmospheric carbon dioxide have gone up. There is an increase in ocean heat and acidification. Sea level has risen, and glacier mass balance as well as Arctic and Antarctic sea ice are melting. The COVID-19 pandemic is expected to cause 6% drop in carbon dioxide emission this year, but it will likely be short-lived and will not stop climate change, the World Meteorological Organization says. In fact, the drop is not even enough to get the world back on track to meet the target of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which aims for global temperature rise of no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That will require at least a 7% annual drop in emissions. The agency states that though there have been falls in carbon emissions due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has seen a dramatic decrease in economic activity, such a reduction, it says, is no substitute for sustained climate action.
This drop of emissions by 6%, that's unfortunately short-term good news. So in most likely case, we would easily go back to the normal next year, and there might even be a boost in the emissions because of some of the industries have been stopped and so forth.
Further increases in global temperatures are expected to aggravate extreme weather incidents such as droughts, famines, and floods, increasing precariousness for millions of people across the world. Given the fact that the last 50 years have seen the physical signs of climate change and their impacts gathering speed at a dangerous rate, the WMO Secretary General insisted that unless the world can mitigate climate change, it will lead to persistent health problems, especially hunger, an inability to feed the growing population of the world, and there will be also more massive impact on economics.
Climate change is a different magnitude of a problem as compared to COVID. COVID is having short-term health problems, causing health problems for the mankind, and this economic impact may be lasting for a few years. And if we are unable to mitigate climate change, we would see persistent health problems, especially hunger and ability to feed the growing population of the world, and there would be also more massive impact on economies.
Once the global economies begin to recover from the new coronavirus, emissions are expected to return to normal. The latest WMO data was published to coincide with the 50th anniversary of Earth Day on the 22nd of April. The report said carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere and oceans for centuries. This means that the world is committed to continued climate change regardless of any temporary fall in emissions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The predicted fall in carbon emissions is mirrored by decreases in levels of common air pollutants from car exhaust and fossil fuel energy, such as nitrous oxide particles. So far this year, global temperatures on a monthly basis have been either the warmest or second warmest on record.
When it comes to pollutants, which are, for example, nitrous oxides or particles, their lifetime is typically from days to weeks, and so the impact is seen more rapidly. But these changes in the carbon emissions, they haven't had any impact on climate so far.
As the whole world struggles to fight the coronavirus pandemic, an unexpected outcome has been clearer skies. China had a significant decrease in nitrogen dioxide pollution in cities like Beijing during February, when factories and streets were closed as authorities attempted to stop the spread of the virus. The space agency's Copernicus Sentinel-5P satellite mission on Friday, the 27th of March, released 3 composite images showing nitrogen dioxide concentrations from the 14th to 25th of March 2020 over France, Spain and Italy, compared to the monthly average of concentrations from 2019.
So what you really see is the centers of this pollution, or the sources of this pollution. But also the other advantage of NO2 is that it is a relatively short-lived gas. It lasts, depending a bit on weather and climate and several conditions, but it lasts roughly half a day. That means it is produced close to the source. You can monitor it close to the source. Of course, it is then dispersed in the atmosphere with the weather, wind, and all the weather elements which you see. But it is quite a good first level indicator of anthropogenic pollution coming from traffic and industry.
And it won't be the first time. When the 2008 financial crisis tipped the world into recession, carbon emissions fell. But as economies grew again, governments proved unable to halt a rebound in emissions. In 2009, global carbon emissions fell from 32 gigatons to 31.5 gigatons, according to the Global Carbon Project. But emissions soon jumped to 33.2 gigatons in 2010. Last year, emissions were at a record high of 36.8 gigatons. This year, over the month of February, Chinese carbon dioxide emissions fell by a quarter, or an estimated 200 million tons. And that's according to Finland's Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Satellite data revealed a sharp fall in Chinese emissions of nitrogen dioxide, a noxious gas emitted by power plants, cars, and factories. But China has since begun to resume business as usual. And there is another reason why many are worried about how big the rebound in emissions will be. The recent huge drop in the price of oil, triggered by a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. There are warnings that the plunge could compromise efforts to bring down carbon emissions. Some say it presents an opportunity to impose more extensive carbon taxes. The World Health Organization describes carbon dioxide as a toxic gas which causes significant inflammation of the airways at concentrations above 200 micrograms per cubic meter. While not a greenhouse gas itself, the pollutants originate from the same activities and industrial sectors that are responsible for a large share of the world's carbon emissions and that drive global heating. Pollution particles may also be a vector for pathogens, as well as exacerbating existing health problems. The World Health Organization is now investigating whether airborne pollution particles may be a vector that spreads COVID-19 and makes it more virulent. An estimated 12.6 million deaths each year are attributable to unhealthy environment, and that is nearly 1 in 4 of total global deaths. Environmental risk factors such as air, water and soil pollution, chemical exposures, climate change and ultraviolet radiation contribute to more than 100 diseases and injuries.
Our economies in the 21st century, in the name of development, have actually begun to kill an extraordinary number of people. If we go by the available statistics that the World Health Organization releases, then almost 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 premature deaths that occur every day, every month, every year on our planet are actually caused by ourselves. That is, in judicial terms, sometimes called manslaughter or murder. Very often, people may not even have realized that when they found a substance or a technology that seemed to offer enormous advantages, that it would one day contribute to the over 12 million premature deaths a year.
Researchers studying the impact of emissions from industry and transport on climate change and human health are scrambling to understand the possible implications of the coronavirus pandemic as economies slow, flight are disrupted, and quarantines imposed.
Spectrometers are measuring in different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. In this particular case, we are having measurements, so we are taking measurements in the ultraviolet, in the visible, the near-infrared, and the shortwave infrared, and there are absorption bands of NO2, and that allows us, therefore, to measure the concentration of NO2 in the atmosphere.
Nitrogen dioxide, a noxious gas emitted by cars, power plants, and factories, is blamed for some respiratory and heart conditions. Almost every city-dwelling European is exposed to pollution levels that exceed healthy levels, according to a 2019 report from European Environment Agency. But campaigners warned city dwellers were still more vulnerable to the epidemic. Data analyzed by the European Public Health Alliance showed cities including Brussels, Paris, Madrid, Milan, and Frankfurt have reduced average levels of nitrogen dioxide. The satellite pictures took a 20-day average picture between 5th and 25th of March and compared data with the same period in 2019. In Madrid, average nitrogen dioxide levels decreased by 56% week on week after the government banned on non-essential travel on the 14th of March.
If you look at the maps, the most significant changes are the regions which are heavily populated and rely on fossil fuel-based transport. So those are the areas usually around the capitals. And then the maps help us to see that if transport decreases, then so does air pollution.
But experts warn those living in polluted cities may be more at risk from COVID-19 because exposure to bad air can weaken the immune system.
Air pollution causes various chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, lung conditions, and if you suffer those conditions, you are more vulnerable to COVID-19, so you are less able to defend yourself against the disease. So that's a very serious risk.
A United Nations report published in November found that emissions will have to start falling by an average of 7.6% per year to give the world a viable chance of limiting the rise in average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the most ambitious Paris goal. With the world dependent for fossil fuels for 80% of its energy, emissions forecasts are often based on projections for global economic growth.
So there are different policies in different continents, for example. So in the EU, as part of their program to reduce carbon emissions, they encouraged the use, they brought in tax policies that encouraged people to buy diesel vehicles. Now, diesel emits a lot more NO2 for the amount of CO2 burned. So for a gallon of diesel, you can go a lot further, but you also release a lot more NO2. So that's what we heard about with Dieselgate and Volkswagen. The effect of that is you can see from space just how much more NO2 and then ozone there is in Europe, and they have a serious problem with it. So as vehicles stop driving as much in Europe, the effect will be magnified, but it will be very short-lived. NO2 does not have a long lifetime. So as soon as everybody gets back to driving again, the numbers are just going to rocket up.
Last month, the Center for International Climate Research in Oslo predicted carbon emissions will fall between 0.3% and 1.2% this year. Using higher and lower forecasts for global GDP growth from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. A few days later, the Breakthrough Institute, a research center in California, predicted emissions will decline 0.5 to 2.2%, basing its calculations on growth forecasts from JP Morgan and assuming the global economy recovers in the second half. The concentration of carbon dioxide, a product of burning fossil fuels, that is the biggest contributor to global warming, surged from 405.5 parts per million in 2017 to 407.8 parts per million in 2018, exceeding the average rate of increase of 2.06 parts per million in 2005, to 2015. Irrespective of future policy, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for centuries, locking in warming trends. The year-on-year surge in methane, a much more potent greenhouse gas than the carbon dioxide, was the highest in the last 20 years. For nitrous oxide, which contributes to ozone destruction and exposes us to harmful ultraviolet rays, it was the highest ever. And an appeal to governments to do more to reverse countries' reliance on producing energy from fossil fuels, in line with the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Secretary General of the WMO warned that the future welfare of mankind is at stake.
We have again broken records in carbon dioxide concentrations, and we have already exceeded 400 ppm level, which was regarded as a critical level. That happened already 2 years ago, and this growth of carbon dioxide concentration continues, and last year's increase was about the same as we have been observing during the past 10 years as an average. In case of methane, we have also been breaking records, and the increase last year was the second highest during the past 10 years. Nitrous oxide, it has contributed about 6% of the warming so far, and it's very much coming from farmlands, and again there we have been breaking records. The steady growth of N2O concentration still continues.
According to the WMO bulletin, global readings indicate that atmospheric methane reached a new high of 1,869 parts per billion in 2018, more than 2.5 times the pre-industrial level. Approximately 40% of methane comes from natural sources, such as wetlands and termites, but 60% comes from human activities, including cattle breeding, paddy fields, mines, landfills, and biomass burning. The bulletin noted that for methane, the increase from 2017 to 2018 was higher than both that observed from 2016 to 2017 and the average over the last decade.
At the moment, we produce 85% of the global energy based on fossil ones, coal, oil and gas, which are shown here, and only 15% based on nuclear, hydro and renewables. And to be successful in implementation of the Paris Agreement, we should revert those numbers in the coming decades.
Based on current data, global emissions are not estimated to peak by 2030, let alone by 2020, if existing climate policies are set out in countries' nationally determined contributions, also known as the NDCs, remain unchanged. The WMO believes that addressing this will involve promoting non-fossil fuel-based energy sources.
Classically, it used to be Europe and North America, USA, but China has become number one emitter, but there has been also fairly strong growth in the emissions of non-OECD countries. And this is demonstrating that if we want to solve this problem, we have to have global efforts. European Union nor USA cannot solve it alone, nor China. We have to have all of the countries on board. Governments nowadays understand that this is a challenge, and what is good news is that the visibility of these issues is highest ever. And the good news is also that the private sector is more and more interested in finding solutions.
On its part, the United Nations Environment Programme released the Emission Gas Report, and it says greenhouse gas emissions surged to a record level and world temperatures could rise by more than twice the globally agreed warming limit if nothing is done. Limiting the rise to 2 degrees Celsius, it will mean annual cut of 2.7%. The report showed that emissions, including those from land use change, such as deforestation, had not yet peaked and rose to a record 55.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2018. The lead author said some of those that had met their targets comfortably, such as Turkey and Russia, should tighten them significantly. Countries face a 2020 deadline to set more ambitious emissions cut pledges. The Emissions Gap report named the United States as one of several large emitters alongside Brazil and Japan, falling short of its own target.
We understand that at 1.5 degrees, 70% of the coral reefs will die. At 2 degrees, practically all coral reefs disappear. We understand that insects that we need for pollination to have our food production will be significantly impacted, and we are likely to lose massive habitats and therefore insects at the higher level. Now, because of climate procrastination, which we have essentially had during these 10 years, we are looking at a 7.6% reduction every year. Is that possible? Absolutely. Will it take political will? Yes. Will we need to have the private sector lean in? Yes. But the science tells us that we can do this.
Experts say that the challenge of tackling this is a daunting one. However, not least because of an increase in carbon dioxide levels, which has basically been stable for a few years. According to the yearly UNEP report, the increased carbon dioxide emissions are linked to an improved economic performance in nations that are hugely reliant on energy produced by fossil fuels, compared with richer nations belonging to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
It's coming because economic growth, especially in developing countries, is really high, and while the OECD countries don't really add to the CO2, they don't really come down a lot either, but the main growth is in developing countries due to economic growth and still relatively high energy and carbon intensity in the energy systems.
Confirming the likely impact of increased emissions on average global temperature rise since the industrial era, the WMO Secretary General said that the world was moving towards the 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warming by the end of this century, instead of 1.5 to 2, which was the Paris Agreement target. For many communities, the issue is not so much temperature increases as more extreme weather events.
We are moving towards 3 to 5 degrees warming by by the end of this century, instead of 1.5 to 2, which was the Paris target. The main impact so far and also by the end of this century is coming from the changes in rainfall patterns, and we have started seeing already some of the regions to become more dry, especially Africa and southern parts of Asia and some parts of Americas, and that's having even bigger impact than the temperature changes.
Hinting at the potential for progress offered by the fact that the cost of renewable energy technology is coming down all the time, making it attractive to the private sector.
And most of the ones that committed to new plans next year and to zero carbon emissions are not in the G20. A few of them are, but not a lot. And then we looked in detail at G20 countries this year, and also have to say that a lot of the plans that have been discussed about have not really been acted on yet.
Global investment in new capacities for renewable energy is on course to reach $2.6 trillion by the end of this decade, more than triple the amount of the previous decade, a report commissioned by the United Nations Environment Programme in September said. Lithium is scattered in volcanic rocks across the hills of Argentina's dry, desolate north. It leaches out during infrequent floods and deposits in the area's low-lying salt plains. Hopes of an electric car boom built on lithium batteries are driving car manufacturers to start signing deals with the mining companies exploring for lithium beneath these salt flats and others in Chile, Bolivia, and the United States. That's our program for today. Thank you for watching. We hope to be back with you next week, but you can reach us on earthfile@channelstv.com anytime and any day. From me, Ayola Kasim, and the rest of the team here in Lagos, it's bye for now.